The year was 1095, and Europe trembled with uncertainty. Famine, violence, and feudal wars plagued the land, while the great Byzantine Empire to the east staggered under the pressure of Turkish armies. Yet it was in the small town of Clermont, in southern France, that a moment unfolded which would ignite centuries of bloodshed and faith, and forever alter the history of Christendom. Beneath the cold November sky, a multitude gathered, nobles in their finery, peasants in their rough wool, priests with crosses in hand, all drawn by the voice of the man who claimed to speak for God himself, Pope Urban II. Standing before the crowd, Urban's words rang out like thunder. He painted vivid pictures of Jerusalem, the holy city where Christ had walked, now, he claimed, defiled by the hands of the infidel. He told tales of Christians in the East suffering persecution, of sacred shrines desecrated, of pilgrims beaten and slain on their journey to the sepulchre of Christ. His voice rose higher, weaving fear, sorrow, and hope into a single tapestry of divine urgency. God wills it, he proclaimed. Deus vult. The cry echoed through the crowd, carried like fire on the wind, until it became not only a slogan, but a command from heaven itself. The scene at Clermont was not merely religious fervor. It was theater, politics, and faith blended into one. Urban knew his audience. To the knights, restless and bloodied from fighting each other across Europe, he offered redemption. Take your violence eastward. Turn your swords not against fellow Christians, but against the enemies of God. To the peasants, weary of hunger and toil, he promised land, wealth, and above all, the salvation of their souls. To all, he held out a prize greater than gold, the remission of sins. Any who took up the cross, he declared, would find their place in heaven secured. The reaction was electric. Men tore strips of cloth to sew into the shape of the cross, fastening them to their tunics as signs of their vow. Others fell to their knees, tears streaming, swearing to march eastward. Chroniclers describe the moment as one of divine madness, as if the hand of God had reached into the hearts of thousands at once. Nobles pledged entire armies, while poor peasants and even children declared their intent to go. It was as though Europe itself had been seized by a fever, its people united for the first time in a common cause, the holy war for Jerusalem. Yet beneath the fervor lay questions unspoken. Was this truly God's will, or the cunning strategy of a pope seeking to strengthen his authority? The Church at Rome, long embroiled in power struggles with kings and emperors, now found a cause that could elevate it above all earthly thrones. By channeling Europe's violence toward the East, Urban not only promised salvation, but secured peace at home, drawing the warring nobility into a single enterprise under his command. Faith may have burned in the hearts of the people, but ambition flickered in the shadows of power. Still, for those gathered at Clermont, there was no doubt. To them, the voice of Urban was the voice of God, the image of Christ's tomb, desecrated and waiting to be freed, burned in their imaginations. The promise of salvation was more certain than bread, more alluring than any earthly crown. When they left Clermont, they carried with them not just the sign of the cross sewn to their tunics, but a conviction that their lives, their deaths, their very souls were now bound to a mission greater than themselves. The First Crusade had not yet begun, but its fire had been lit. That fire would carry peasants across fields, knights across mountains, and armies across seas. It would burn cities, reshape kingdoms, and leave scars that stretched across centuries. And all of it began with a cry in a small French town. Deus vult. Was this the voice of heaven, or the echo of human ambition cloaked in holiness? That question would haunt the Crusades from their first march to their final retreat. When Pope Urban II lifted his voice at Clermont, he did more than summon Europe to holy war. He reshaped the balance of power. To the faithful, his words rang as God's command. But to the discerning eye, they also bore the marks of political genius. For centuries, popes had struggled against kings and emperors, each vying to dominate Christendom. Urban's call to crusade was not only a cry for Jerusalem, it was a masterstroke designed to place the papacy at the very heart of medieval power. Europe, at the close of the 11th century, was a land divided. Kings quarreled with their nobles, nobles quarreled with each other, and the papacy itself had recently emerged from the bitter investiture controversy, where emperors and popes fought over who held the right to appoint bishops. Urban's crusade answered all of these tensions at once. By redirecting the violence of Europe's restless nights toward the east, he promised peace at home. By portraying the papacy as the champion of Christendom, he elevated Rome above emperor and king alike. The strategy was brilliant because it was cloaked in Scripture. Urban invoked Christ's words, "Whoever doesn't take up their cross and follow me isn't worthy of me." He framed the war not as politics, but as salvation. Knights who had spilled Christian blood in endless feuds were now offered a path to forgiveness. If only they would march east, lords could secure both earthly glory and heavenly reward. Even peasants, who owned no land and wielded no sword, were promised that their footsteps on the road to Jerusalem would echo in eternity. By binding the cause to God's will, Urban transformed a papal initiative into a divine mandate. But there was another layer to Urban's design. The Byzantine emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, had appealed to Rome for aid against the Turks. This plea offered Urban a golden opportunity. By sending armies east, he could not only rescue Byzantium, but also extend papal influence into lands where the Eastern Church had long resisted Rome's authority. The crusade was therefore not only about liberating Jerusalem, but about forging a bridge, or perhaps a chain, between East and West, placing the papacy at the center of Christian unity. And yet, was this unity truly selfless? Chroniclers hint at Urban's shrewdness. He knew that a holy war would silence dissent within Christendom. Who could question the Pope's authority if he alone held the keys to salvation for crusaders? Who could resist his command when disobedience meant defying the will of God? Through the crusade, Urban bound the faithful more tightly to Rome, ensuring that kings, nobles, and commoners alike looked not to emperor or bishop, but to the papacy as the beating heart of Christendom's mission. Still, to dismiss the crusade as mere politics would be to ignore the sincerity of faith in that age. Urban himself was a man of the church, shaped by decades of devotion. He truly believed that Jerusalem was holy ground, and that reclaiming it was a service to God. Perhaps then it wasn't a choice between faith and ambition, but a fusion of both. A conviction that God's will and papal strategy marched hand in hand. This duality defined the Crusades from the beginning. For some, they were the highest expression of devotion. For others, the cleverest tool of power. When nobles stitched crosses to their cloaks, they believed they bore the mark of Christ. But they also carried the invisible seal of Rome. When armies marched east, they did so under the banner of salvation, but also under the direction of a pope who had bound their swords to his vision. Thus, the cry of Deus vult was both holy and political, both genuine and calculated. It summoned men to God's cause, but also to the papacy's cause. The question lingered then, as it does now. Were the Crusades born of heaven's will, or of Rome's ambition? Across the fields and towns of Europe, the cry of Deus vult spread like wildfire. But to answer that cry was no small matter. It meant binding one's very soul to a sacred promise. To take the cross was to swear an oath before God, an oath that transformed ordinary men and women into pilgrims of war. Whether knight or peasant, noble lady or barefoot child, the act of sewing a cross onto cloak or tunic marked a new identity, not subject of a king, but soldier of Christ. For the nobility, the Crusaders' oath was both burden and opportunity. A knight, blood-stained by feudal quarrels, might see in the oath a chance for redemption. By marching east, he could wash away the sins of slaughter, theft, or broken vows. The Church promised indulgences, remission of sins, escape from purgatory, for any who bore arms in God's cause. To knights, it was irresistible. The same sword that damned them at home could save them abroad. At last, their violence had holy purpose. But beneath the vow lay ambitions less holy. For many lords, the crusade offered adventure, land, and plunder. Jerusalem was painted not only as the city of God, but as a prize of unimaginable wealth. Rumors spread of golden domes, treasures hidden in the east, lands rich and ripe for conquest. When a noble knelt before the altar and swore his oath, faith and desire often mingled, inseparably twined. Was he pledging himself to Christ, or to his own hunger for fortune? The oath also reached beyond the knightly class. Peasants, weary of hunger and taxes, saw in the cross a path to freedom. For once the poor could walk the same road as kings, their feet sanctified by pilgrimage. Even women and children joined the tide, convinced that to march eastward was to walk into God's arms. Chroniclers describe crowds swelling with zeal, entire villages emptying as people left behind fields, homes, and families. Some believed the very act of journeying to Jerusalem would guarantee salvation, regardless of whether they ever saw its walls. Yet the oath was also a chain. Once taken, it bound a crusader's soul. To abandon the journey was not mere cowardice. It was betrayal of God himself. Knights sold estates, mortgaged castles, and emptied treasuries to fund their passage, knowing the vow demanded total commitment. Families were left vulnerable, lands unguarded, for a pledge that reached far beyond earthly duty. It was as though each man who bore the cross had already stepped into another world, one where the ordinary rules of life no longer applied. The ceremonies of the vow deepened its gravity. Priests blessed the Crusaders, sometimes placing the Bible or relics before them as they swore. The moment was charged with awe and fear, for the Crusader pledged not only his sword, but his very salvation. He promised to walk as a pilgrim, endure hardship, and shed blood in the name of Christ. In return, he received the mark of the cross, stitched onto his cloak, a visible sign that heaven itself had claimed him. But the oath did not silence doubt. Even as peasants trudged barefoot and nobles donned armor, whispers spread of false motives and hidden sins. Was every crusader truly driven by faith? Or were some cloaking greed, vengeance, or desperation beneath the red cross? The paradox of the oath was clear. It sanctified the journey, yet it could not purify the heart. In each crusader marched both the pilgrim and the conqueror, the penitent and the plunderer. As the tide of humanity surged eastward, knights in glittering mail, peasants dragging carts, priests bearing relics, the Crusaders' oath stood as the invisible bond that united them. It was not the sword that tied together this vast chaotic army, but the shared vow sworn before heaven. Each man and woman believed they were more than mortal. They were chosen, armed with God's promise. and with that oath burning in their hearts, they began the long, perilous march toward Jerusalem, convinced that salvation lay at the end of the road. The great host that left Europe was less an army than a human tide. Knights glittered in their mail, lords led banners of noble houses, but alongside them trudged barefoot peasants, women, and even children, all bound by the oath of the cross. Their journey eastward was no triumphal march. It was a crucible of hunger, disease, betrayal, and slaughter. And yet at every step, they believed heaven's hand guided their feet. But faith did not always yield mercy. Before they had even left Europe, the Crusaders' zeal turned against their own neighbors. In the Rhineland, bands of self-proclaimed People's Crusaders fell upon Jewish communities, declaring them enemies of Christ. Entire towns were massacred, their synagogues burned, men, women, and children slain in God's name. These were not the infidels of the East, but fellow subjects of Christian kings, victims of the fever sparked at Clermont. Already, the crusade blurred the line between holy war and human ambition, between faith and fury. The march itself was a torment. Armies stumbled across Hungary and into Byzantine lands, starving, stealing, and quarreling. The Byzantines, who had asked for aid, now watched uneasily as this unruly horde poured into their territory, less allies than dangerous guests. Yet still they pressed on, through Anatolia's barren plains, where thirst and heat slew more than the Turks' arrows. Chroniclers tell of men reduced to drinking foul water, of horses collapsing in the dust, of corpses left unburied beneath the blazing sun. The crusade was no glorious procession. It was a slow, grinding death march. Yet against all odds, they endured. At Antioch, the Crusaders faced one of their greatest trials. Besieging the city for months, they themselves became the besieged when Muslim reinforcements encircled them. Famine reduced them to eating horses, leather, even grass. Morale teetered on collapse, until a supposed miracle turned despair into fire. A peasant claimed to have discovered the Holy Lance, the very spear that pierced Christ's side. Whether fraud or faith, its revelation electrified the starving army. With renewed zeal, they burst forth and drove back their enemies, convinced that God had given them victory. This mingling of desperation and faith carried them ever closer to their goal. And in 1099, after years of hardship, the Crusaders beheld Jerusalem. To see the city of Christ at last was to glimpse heaven on earth. They wept, prayed, and then prepared for war. On July 15, 1099, they stormed the walls, climbing ladders, smashing gates, pouring into streets holy to three religions. And there, amid the cries of triumph, the crusade revealed its darkest face. For 3 days, Jerusalem drowned in blood. Chroniclers describe streets choked with corpses, mosques filled with the slain, Jews burned alive in their synagogues, Muslims cut down without mercy. Knights rode through gore up to their knees, killing in the name of God. To the Crusaders, it was a purification, God's judgment poured upon the unfaithful. To their victims, it was apocalypse. When the bloodlust subsided, the city was theirs, and the Crusaders fell to their knees, weeping at the Holy Sepulchre, certain that heaven had crowned their suffering with victory. The First Crusade had achieved the impossible. Against famine, plague, and endless enemies, the Crusaders had carved their way to Jerusalem and taken it by storm. Yet the price was horror. The cross they bore upon their tunics was stained with the blood of thousands, their holy war baptized in slaughter. Was this the will of God, or the ambition of men who mistook their own violence for divine command? As the Crusaders knelt in Jerusalem's shattered streets, they believed their triumph eternal. But the war they began would not end with victory. It was only the opening act of centuries of conflict, as faith and ambition collided on the scarred soil of the Holy Land. When Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders in 1099, the victors proclaimed that Christendom had triumphed. They knelt at the Holy Sepulchre, tears streaming, believing they had reclaimed the city for God Himself. Yet as the blood dried on the stones and the bodies of the slain were dragged away, a new reality began to take shape. The warriors of the cross had not come only as pilgrims, they came also as conquerors. And conquerors require crowns, castles, and kingdoms. Almost immediately, the Crusaders set about carving the Holy Land into lordships and principalities. Jerusalem was declared a kingdom, with Godfrey of Bouillon, one of the Crusades' leaders, refusing the title of king and instead styling himself advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. His piety seemed to elevate the new state above mere earthly rule. But after his death, the pretense faded. His brother Baldwin took the crown outright, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem was born. Other Crusaders claimed Edessa, Antioch, and Tripoli, establishing feudal realms where knights ruled as lords over foreign peoples. These Crusader states were built on contradictions. On one hand, they were presented as the earthly reflection of God's kingdom, ruled in His name. On the other, they functioned like any feudal domain: lands divided, castles built, vassals sworn, taxes collected. For all their pious trappings, they were kingdoms of men, sustained not by miracles but by walls, swords, and uneasy alliances with local powers. The ruling elite quickly became entangled in the politics of the region. Marriage alliances were made not only with Western nobles, but sometimes with local Christian and even Muslim leaders. Trade routes were secured, treaties negotiated, rivalries stoked. The dream of a pure kingdom of God blurred as pragmatism and ambition dictated policy. A Crusader baron might kneel at the sepulchre one day and bargain with a Muslim emir the next. Holiness, it seemed, could not govern without compromise. Meanwhile, the local population, Greek Christians, Armenians, Muslims, and Jews, lived under Crusader rule. For many, this meant heavy taxation and strict laws. Though some Christians were tolerated and even integrated, Muslims often endured second-class status, their lands seized, their freedoms curtailed. The rhetoric of holy liberation gave way to the realities of conquest and domination. For the people of the land, the Crusaders were not deliverers of God's justice, but foreign lords, their crosses little different from any conqueror's banner. The Crusaders themselves were caught in a strange tension. Many had come as pilgrims, seeking salvation, yet found themselves as rulers, trapped in cycles of war and governance. Some clung to ideals of piety, founding orders like the Knights Templar and Hospitallers, who combined monastic vows with martial duty. These warrior monks embodied the paradox of the Crusades, sworn to poverty and prayer, yet wielding swords and commanding castles. Their very existence blurred the line between serving God and serving earthly power. Jerusalem itself became a city of contrasts. The sepulchre was adorned with relics, hymns echoed in the streets, and pilgrims streamed through its gates. Yet outside its walls, armies gathered, ready to strike. The holy city was less a kingdom of heaven than a fortress under siege, its rulers constantly preparing for war. The cross stood over its towers, but it was held up by the same iron and blood that sustained any medieval realm. So were the Crusader states truly God's kingdoms, or merely feudal outposts draped in holiness? To the faithful, they were proof that Christendom had conquered. To their rulers, they were prizes hard won, lands to be defended and expanded. To their subjects, they were often a foreign yoke. The truth lay somewhere in between. They were kingdoms built on faith but sustained by ambition, holy in name yet worldly in practice. The Crusaders had sworn an oath to liberate the Holy Land for God, but in the ashes of conquest, they built not only altars, but thrones. And as they sat upon them, the question grew louder. Had they established God's realm on earth, or simply replaced one set of rulers with another? While the Crusaders raised their banners above Jerusalem and proclaimed God's triumph, the Muslim world stirred with anger, grief, and determination. To the people of Islam, Jerusalem was no less sacred. It was the site of the Prophet's night journey, a city sanctified by centuries of devotion. The sudden arrival of foreign conquerors who slaughtered its inhabitants and desecrated its mosques was not seen as liberation, but as catastrophe. And from this wound would rise leaders who vowed to reclaim what had been lost. At first, the Muslim response was fragmented. The Islamic world of the 11th century was divided among rival dynasties, Seljuks, Fatimids, and local emirs, each more concerned with their own survival than with unity. This disunity had been the Crusaders' greatest advantage, allowing them to seize lands and fortresses despite being vastly outnumbered. But conquest breeds resistance, and as the Crusader states entrenched themselves, voices of jihad began to grow louder. Into this chaos stepped a figure who would come to embody Muslim resistance: Saladin. Born of Kurdish stock, he rose not from nobility but from service, proving himself through loyalty, cunning, and military genius. By the mid-12th century, he had united Egypt and Syria under his rule, forging the very unity the Crusaders feared. To Muslims, he was a defender of the faith, a warrior chosen by God to restore justice. To Crusaders, he was the looming storm on the horizon, a leader whose name alone filled men with dread. Saladin's greatness was not merely in his sword, but in his vision. Unlike many rulers of the time, he understood that the Crusades were not a passing invasion, but a lasting threat. He wove together alliances, balanced politics with piety, and made jihad not only a call to arms, but a rallying cry of identity. Under his banner, Muslims did not simply fight for land. They fought for their faith, their heritage, their sacred city. The clash between Crusader and Muslim was more than battle. It was a collision of worlds. Crusaders saw themselves as warriors of Christ, sanctified by the cross. Muslims saw themselves as defenders of Islam, sanctified by the crescent. Both sides believed God's hand guided their swords, that each victory was heaven's blessing and each defeat a test of faith. The battlefield became not just a contest of armies, but of religions proclaiming divine favor. The decisive moment came in 1187 at the Battle of Hattin. Saladin's forces surrounded the Crusader army under the blazing sun, cutting them off from water until thirst consumed them. The Crusaders, once proud and invincible, collapsed under the heat and the onslaught. Their king, Guy of Lusignan, was captured. The true cross, the most sacred relic of the Crusaders, was seized by Saladin. The defeat shattered Crusader power and opened the road to Jerusalem. When Saladin entered the Holy City, the contrast with the Crusaders' conquest was stark. He spared its people, allowing Christians to ransom themselves and depart. There were no rivers of blood, no fires consuming synagogues. Instead, he restored the Dome of the Rock to Muslim worship and declared Jerusalem once again a city of Islam. To Muslims, this was God's justice made manifest. To Crusaders, it was a humiliation that shook the foundations of their faith. And yet, even in the midst of war, there was respect. Chronicles tell of Saladin's chivalry, how he treated captives with honor, how he sent physicians to heal his enemies. His character became legend in both East and West, a reminder that even in the clash of faiths, humanity could flicker amid hatred. But his victories also ensured that the Crusades would not end. They would continue, wave after wave, as Europe rallied again and again to reclaim Jerusalem. The clash of faiths was thus not only military, but spiritual. Each side believed God had given them the city. Each prayed for his favor. Each justified slaughter with scripture. Jerusalem, caught between cross and crescent, became the very stage of divine rivalry. And as Saladin's banners rose over its walls, Christendom was forced to confront a bitter truth. The city of God could be lost. Long after the dust of Jerusalem settled and the blood of Hattin dried, the crusading spirit continued to ripple across Europe. The idea of holy war had seeped so deeply into the medieval imagination that it no longer needed papal voices or battlefield victories to sustain it. From royal courts to peasant huts, from bustling cities to mountain monasteries, the crusade had become part of the very fabric of European life, an intoxicating blend of faith, duty, and ambition. Economically, the Crusades transformed Europe. Armies marching east required food, weapons, armor, horses, and ships, and so merchants thrived on the demand. Italian city-states like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa grew wealthy as they ferried crusaders across the seas and traded with the East. From these exchanges, spices, silks, and ideas flowed back into Europe, enriching markets and reshaping tastes. A knight might take the cross for salvation, but his journey helped open a corridor of commerce that connected Christendom to lands it had scarcely known. In this way, holy war became a channel for wealth, even as it drained kingdoms of treasure. Culturally, the crusade spirit inspired a flood of art, music, and literature. Songs of crusading knights filled the halls of castles, painting them as heroes chosen by God. Chronicles recounted victories and martyrdoms with the awe of Scripture itself, turning warriors into saints of the battlefield. Even architecture bore its mark. Castles in the Holy Land influenced fortress designs back in Europe, and churches were built to mimic the great Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. To live in Europe after Clermont was to live in a world where the cross was not only a symbol of faith, but of destiny. But the crusade spirit also had darker consequences. Taxes levied to fund expeditions burdened peasants and townsfolk, while lords who mortgaged lands to march east often returned bankrupt, or not at all. Families were torn apart as men vanished for years, leaving wives and children to fend alone. Some never returned, their bones lost on distant roads, their names remembered only in prayers. For many common folk, the crusade was not glory, but sacrifice demanded in the name of heaven. And still, the fever grew. Preachers wandered through towns, whipping up zeal with fiery sermons. They promised forgiveness, indulgence, and eternal life to those who joined. The cry of Deus vult became more than a slogan. It was a summons that pierced consciences, leaving even the hesitant trembling. So powerful was the idea of crusade that it infected even the young. In 1212, the so-called Children's Crusade saw thousands of boys and girls set out toward the Holy Land, believing their innocence alone would conquer where armies had failed. Most never saw Jerusalem. Many perished or were sold into slavery. Yet their doomed march shows how deeply the crusade spirit consumed society, blinding even the most vulnerable with the lure of God's will. At its height, the crusade spirit stretched beyond Jerusalem. Crusades were declared not only against Muslims, but against heretics in Europe, against pagan tribes in the Baltic, even against Christian rivals. The word crusade had become elastic, capable of sanctifying any war Rome chose. For a time, it seemed as if no conflict could be fought without the cross as its banner. To doubt the crusade was to doubt God himself. And yet, whispers of unease grew louder. Some questioned whether all this bloodshed truly reflected Christ's teaching. Others saw how crusading enriched merchants and kings more than it glorified God. Was the cross still a holy symbol, or had it become a mask for greed? Such doubts lingered at the edges of society, fragile but persistent, hinting that faith and ambition were locked in a dangerous embrace. Europe, for better or worse, had been remade by the crusading spirit. It opened doors to trade, culture, and knowledge, yet drained resources, spread violence, and blurred the line between holiness and ambition. Above all, it left an indelible mark on the medieval soul. To live in this age was to live in a world where the cross was not merely a symbol of salvation. It was a call to arms. The cry of Deus vult had begun as a call to liberate the Holy Sepulchre, yet within a century it was being wielded in ways that bore little resemblance to Urban II's vision at Clermont. The crusading banner, once raised against the infidel in the East, was increasingly unfurled for causes that looked suspiciously like ambition cloaked in sanctity. By the 13th century, the word crusade could sanctify wars not only in Jerusalem, but across Europe, turning God's banner into a weapon of politics, greed, and even betrayal. The most infamous of these misuses was the Fourth Crusade. Declared in 1202 with the intent of reclaiming the Holy Land, it quickly veered off course. The Crusaders, heavily indebted to Venice for transport, found themselves compelled into the service of Venetian ambition. Instead of marching to Jerusalem, they attacked the Christian city of Zara, sacking it in the name of the cross. Pope Innocent III excommunicated them for their crime. But the Crusaders pressed on, their mission ever further from its holy origins. Worse was yet to come. Lured by promises of wealth and political intrigue, the Crusaders turned their gaze on Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the East. In 1204, they stormed its walls, looting its treasures, desecrating its churches, and enthroning their own Latin emperor. Relics were stolen, holy places defiled, the Hagia Sophia itself turned into a stable for horses. Here was the ultimate perversion of the crusading ideal. Christians slaughtering Christians, the cross raised not against Islam, but against fellow heirs of the faith. For many, it was proof that the crusade had become less God's war than man's betrayal. Other misuses were subtler, but no less tragic. Crusades were declared against heretics within Christendom, most notoriously the Albigensian Crusade in southern France. Entire towns were massacred in the name of rooting out heresy, the papal legate's infamous command ringing in history. Kill them all, God will know his own. What began as a mission to reclaim holy lands had become a license for internal purges. Holy war turned inward, against the Church's own flock. And then there was the Children's Crusade. In 1212, thousands of boys and girls across France and Germany were seized by a vision that their innocence alone could succeed where armies had failed. Singing hymns and carrying crosses, they set out toward the Mediterranean, convinced the seas would part for them as the Red Sea had parted for Moses. The seas did not part. Many starved or perished on the journey. Others were betrayed and sold into slavery, their dream ending not in Jerusalem, but in misery. Chroniclers saw in this tragedy both the depth of the crusading fever and the cruelty of a world where innocence could be exploited under God's name. These episodes revealed the fragility of the crusading ideal. When yoked to earthly ambition, the banner of God became a mask for conquest, greed, and cruelty. Yet each time, the papacy still found ways to justify the cause. Indulgences were offered, sins remitted, the cry of Deus vult repeated, even as its meaning grew hollow. For some, the very word crusade lost its purity, becoming synonymous not with holy duty but with betrayal and corruption. And yet, for all its misuse, the crusading banner retained its power. Men still marched at its call, still swore their oaths, still believed heaven was bound to their swords. Even when crusades targeted fellow Christians, the faithful were told their mission was sanctified. The banner of God, once pure, had become dangerously pliable, able to justify nearly any war Rome desired. The misuse of God's banner marked a turning point. It revealed the temptation that lurked within holy war, that once sanctified, any ambition could wear the cloak of righteousness. And so the crusade, born in faith, risked drowning in the very human vices it claimed to transcend. The Crusades had begun as a unifying cry, Deus vult. But as the centuries passed, their legacy grew tangled, leaving behind not only glory, but suspicion, wounds, and fractures that never fully healed. What was proclaimed as the will of God had, by the 13th century, left Christendom both stronger in some ways and deeply scarred in others. Faith had been sharpened into a weapon. Fire had consumed countless lives, and fracture had become the lingering inheritance of an age of holy war. For the papacy, the Crusades were at first a triumph. Urban Sekou had sought to raise Rome above kings and emperors, and in that he succeeded. To declare a crusade was to wield the ultimate authority, the power to forgive sins, to sanctify bloodshed, to direct the armies of Europe with a single voice. Popes became the orchestrators of holy war, and for a time, their prestige soared. Each new crusade confirmed that they, not monarchs, were the arbiters of heaven's will on earth. Yet this very authority bred corruption. When the Fourth Crusade ended not in Jerusalem, but in the sack of Constantinople, when crusades were turned against heretics, when indulgences were sold like coin in a market, whispers grew. Was the papacy truly God's voice, or merely a throne of ambition disguised in holiness? The more Rome wielded the cross for politics, the more the faithful began to question. Seeds of doubt took root, fragile at first, but destined to bloom centuries later in the storms of reform. The fracture extended beyond Christendom's borders. The Muslim world, once divided, found unity in resistance. Leaders like Saladin had forged a vision of jihad that outlived their lifetimes, shaping Islamic memory for centuries. To Muslims, the Crusaders became the invaders, their holy war a scar that marked Christians as aggressors. The blood spilled in Jerusalem, Antioch, and countless villages deepened a divide between the crescent and the cross, a divide that echoes still in the memory of nations. And perhaps most tragically, the Crusades fractured Christendom itself. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 shattered trust between the Latin West and the Greek East. Instead of healing the schism, the Crusade deepened it, leaving the Byzantine Empire broken and resentful. For Orthodox Christians, the Crusaders were not liberators but traitors, their banners of the cross soaked with Christian blood. The dream of a united Christendom lay in ruins, buried beneath the ashes of Constantinople. Meanwhile, within Europe, the Crusade spirit both inspired and consumed. It brought back knowledge, Arabic science, Greek philosophy preserved in Muslim lands, new medicines, new trade. Europe grew richer and more curious because of its contact with the East. But it also grew harsher, more accustomed to violence dressed in sanctity. To wage war in God's name became a habit that outlived the Crusades, shaping how kings and popes alike justified conquest. The crusading spirit, once bound to Jerusalem, would later be invoked in Spain against Muslims, in the Baltic against pagans, even in colonial ventures centuries later. The fire lit at Clermont burned far beyond its age. For the ordinary faithful, the fracture was most personal. They had given sons, wealth, and lives to wars that often ended in defeat or betrayal. Some returned disillusioned, others broken, while many never returned at all. Families mourned, villages emptied, and yet the promise of salvation kept the crusading flame alive. But quietly, doubts crept in. Was God truly in these wars? Or had his name been used as a cloak for ambitions that left only suffering behind? Faith, fire, and fracture. These were the true legacies of the Crusades. They inspired devotion, yet revealed corruption. They spread learning, yet deepened enmity. They lifted the papacy, yet sowed distrust. What had begun as a cry to liberate Jerusalem ended by dividing Christendom, reshaping Europe, and leaving scars across the East and West alike. And so, by the close of the Middle Ages, the Crusades stood not as a single chapter of triumph or failure, but as a mirror, reflecting both the heights of human faith and the depths of human ambition, bound together in a story written in blood and prayer. As the last Crusaders faded from the Holy Land and the banner of the cross sank beneath the weight of defeat, the question lingered like a shadow across the centuries. Were the Crusades truly God's holy wars? Or were they the ambitions of men dressed in the garments of faith? The answer is not simple, for the story of the Crusades is a tapestry woven with both devotion and deceit, piety and pride, sacrifice and greed. For the knights who marched east, many carried a faith so deep that it defied reason. They believed every step on the dusty road to Jerusalem was sanctified, every wound a mark of Christ, every death a gateway to eternal life. To them, the crusade was not politics, it was pilgrimage by the sword. Their letters home speak of joy at beholding the Holy Sepulchre, of tears shed in prayer, of conviction that their blood cleansed their sins. These voices cannot be dismissed. For countless crusaders, the war was indeed holy, a divine call they answered with all their hearts. And yet, alongside the faithful stood the ambitious. Lords who mortgaged their lands did not march only for salvation. They dreamed of castles in Antioch, estates in Tripoli, crowns in Jerusalem. Merchants who ferried armies across the seas did not see merely the will of God. They saw markets, trade routes, and profits gleaming on the horizon. Even popes, cloaked in robes of sanctity, used the Crusades to extend their authority, to humble kings, to heal or deepen schisms. Behind the cross, ambition marched shoulder to shoulder with faith. The paradox of the Crusades lies in their duality. They unleashed both horror and hope. They spilled rivers of blood, yet also carried pilgrims to the holiest sites of Christendom. They destroyed Constantinople, yet opened Europe to knowledge from the East. They fostered piety, yet bred corruption. They were at once acts of devotion and acts of power, proof of the heights and the failings of medieval man. For those who suffered, the Jews massacred in the Rhineland, the Muslims slaughtered in Jerusalem, the Orthodox Christians betrayed at Constantinople. The Crusades could never be holy. To them, they were the brutal face of conquest. No different from any invasion cloaked in lies, their cries remind us that one man's salvation can be another's damnation, that the will of God proclaimed in one tongue can sound like tyranny in another. Yet for those who fought, bled, and died believing they marched with heaven at their side, the Crusades were the truest test of faith. They bore hunger, thirst, and death with a conviction that their suffering was Christ's command. Even in failure, they believed God's hand had guided them. Perhaps the Crusades, then, were not wholly holy nor wholly human, but something far more tragic, a collision of belief and ambition, each feeding the other until neither could be separated. As history's dust settles, we are left with questions rather than answers. Was it God who willed these wars, or men who willed them in his name? Was Jerusalem truly worth the rivers of blood spilled upon its stones, or was it the prize of human pride? The Crusades do not yield a single truth. They hold a mirror to humanity itself, showing how easily faith can inspire sacrifice, and how easily ambition can twist that sacrifice into ruin. Holy war or human ambition? Perhaps they were both. Perhaps they had to be both, for without the fire of faith no army would have marched, and without the lure of ambition no throne would have been claimed. In the end, the Crusades were less about God descending to guide men, and more about men raising the banner of God to guide themselves into glory, into tragedy, into history,